Welcome, weary traveler, to this cozy little corner of history. Tonight, before we step into a world of ancient myths and forgotten empires, allow me to offer you a warm greeting. Whether you're curled up under blankets, preparing to drift into sleep, or simply seeking a gentle story from the past to soothe your evening, I'm truly grateful you've joined me. If you don't mind, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Feel free to share it in the comments. It's always a joy to see this community of history lovers connecting across so many places. And if you enjoy calm, immersive journeys into the past, be sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter. But for now, let's leave behind the modern world and walk through the mists of time, back to the muddy banks of the Tiber River, where wolves watched over kings, where senators conspired beneath marble arches, and where the world would learn the meaning of power, pride, and legacy. This is the story of Rome, the eternal city, the empire that never truly died. The story of Rome begins not with a date carved in stone, but with a myth echoing through the centuries, one that binds divine intervention to fratricidal ambition. According to Roman tradition, the twin brothers Romulus and Remus, sons of the war god Mars and the Vestal Virgin Rhea Silvia, were cast into the wild to die, only to be suckled and protected by a she-wolf. Raised by a humble shepherd, they grew into defiant young men with dreams of building a city that would outlast them. Yet when the time came to decide its location, the same blood that united them also divided them. Remus mocked Romulus's walls, and in a fit of rage, Romulus struck him down. Thus, with the blood of a brother, the foundations of Rome were laid in 753 BCE, a city born in conflict, destined to conquer. In its earliest days, Rome was a small hilltop settlement among many on the Italian peninsula, nestled beside the Tiber River. It was ruled by kings, 7 in total, according to later Roman historians, some of whom were likely based in history, and others wholly legendary. Among them were kings like Numa Pompilius, who was credited with establishing religious rites and rituals that would define Roman spiritual life, and Servius Tullius, who was said to have organized the population into a system of classes based on wealth, laying the groundwork for Rome's later military and political structures. But it was Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, the 7th and final king, who brought monarchy to its bitter end. His reign was marked by arrogance, violence, and the oppression of the Roman people. The turning point came with a singular act of cruelty, the rape of Lucretia, a noblewoman, by the king's son, Sextus Tarquinius. Her suicide in protest became a spark that ignited revolution. The Roman aristocracy, led by Lucius Junius Brutus and other outraged elites, rose in defiance. In 509 BCE, they expelled the monarchy and vowed never to be ruled by a king again. From this vow was born the Roman Republic, a new experiment in governance, forged in hatred of tyranny and based in theory on shared power and mutual accountability. It was not a democracy in the modern sense, but rather an oligarchic system where power was vested in the Senate, composed of patricians, Rome's landowning elite, and annually elected magistrates known as consuls. Yet from the very beginning, this new system was riddled with tension. The plebeians, or commoners, who made up the majority of the population, found themselves excluded from real power. Though they could vote, only patricians could be elected to high office. Over the ensuing decades, a bitter social struggle, What later historians would call the conflict of the orders would begin to unfold. The plebeians sought legal protections and a voice in government, while the patricians sought to preserve their privilege. The Republic was, from its inception, a battleground not only of legions and swords, but of rights and representation. Even as these internal struggles simmered, Rome's external ambitions grew. The fledgling republic was surrounded by rival tribes and hostile city-states, the Etruscans to the north, the Latins and Volscians to the south. Each year, Rome's consuls led their citizens in war, not only for survival, but increasingly for dominance. As Rome grew, so too did the institutions designed to manage it. Magistracies multiplied, laws became more complex, and Rome's unique concept of citizenship began to emerge as both a legal status and an imperial tool. Still, the ghosts of monarchy were never far. The figure of the king had been outlawed, but the power once wielded by kings slowly seeped into the hands of generals, senators, and ambitious politicians. Rome had overthrown its kings, but it had not yet learned how to prevent new forms of domination from emerging under republican disguise. The early Roman Republic stood as a fragile yet determined experiment in shared governance. With the kings banished and the monarchy outlawed, Rome's elite patrician class assumed authority, organizing the state around annually elected consuls who held imperium, or executive power. The Senate, though technically advisory, quickly evolved into the Republic's most enduring institution, wielding immense influence over military campaigns, foreign policy, and public finance. However, the balance of power remained skewed, with the plebeian majority excluded from significant political decision-making. This imbalance bred resentment. As Rome waged war against its neighbors, Latin, Sabine, Aequi, and Volsci tribes, the plebeians filled the ranks of the army, bearing the burden of defense and conquest while receiving little protection at home. Indebtedness, landlessness, and legal vulnerability weighed heavily upon them. In 494 BCE, the plebeians staged a dramatic secession from the city, retreating to the Sacred Mount and refusing to fight until their grievances were addressed. The patricians, fearing collapse, conceded. The office of the tribune of the plebs was created, an unprecedented magistracy empowered to protect plebeians against patrician abuses and veto official decisions. Though theoretically revolutionary, the tribunate was a beginning, not a resolution. The plebeians demanded codified laws, fearing arbitrary rulings by patrician judges. In response, the 12 tables were inscribed around 450 BCE, Rome's first attempt at a public, written legal code. These bronze tablets were displayed in the Forum, offering citizens a glimpse of justice, even if imperfect. Yet the laws revealed the deep social cleavages. They forbade intermarriage between classes and sanctioned harsh penalties, reflecting the biases of their authors. Still, the 12 tables became sacred, forming the bedrock of Roman jurisprudence for centuries to come. As Rome's internal order evolved, so too did its external standing. The Latin League, a confederation of Central Italian communities, increasingly viewed Rome as a hegemonic force. Clashes became inevitable. By the end of the 5th century BCE, Rome had asserted dominance over many of these neighbors, securing treaties, subjugating rivals, and planting colonies. This strategy of conquest followed by integration would become a hallmark of Roman expansion. Military might, followed by roads, citizenship, and taxation. However, not all enemies were external. Within the Republic, the struggle between patricians and plebeians intensified.
laws gradually opened offices to plebeians, first the consulship, then the dictatorship, and finally the highest religious posts. The Licinian Sextian laws of 367 BCE mandated that one consul each year must be a plebeian. These victories marked milestones in what would be a centuries-long effort to rebalance the republic's political structure. Yet true equality remained elusive, for wealthy plebeians often joined patricians in a new ruling elite known as the nobilitas, leaving the poorer classes still marginalized. Meanwhile, the 4th century BCE tested Rome's resilience in a manner few could have anticipated. In 390 BCE, a band of Gallic warriors under the chieftain Brennus descended from the north and inflicted a devastating defeat upon the Roman army at the Battle of the Ilia. The victors entered the undefended city and sacked it, burning temples and homes alike. The Romans, humiliated and desperate, paid a ransom in gold to spare what remained. It was a national trauma, etched into the Roman memory with bitterness. From the ashes of that catastrophe arose a newfound determination. Rome would never again be so vulnerable. To ensure this, the city's walls were rebuilt, its legions reorganized, and its diplomacy sharpened. Over the coming decades, Rome methodically brought central Italy under its sway, defeating the Etruscans to the north and the Samnites to the south in a series of brutal wars. The Samnite Wars, fought between 343 and 290 BCE, were particularly transformative. The Samnites, mountain warriors of formidable skill, matched Rome in tenacity and tactics. The Roman defeat at the Caudine Forks, where an entire army was forced to surrender and pass under the yoke in humiliation, could have ended their ambitions. Instead, it hardened Roman resolve. Rome responded with institutional and tactical innovation. The manipular legion, more flexible and mobile than the rigid phalanx, emerged from this period. Roads were extended, colonies established, and defeated peoples were drawn into a complex web of alliances. By offering varying degrees of citizenship and legal status, Rome co-opted its former enemies. They were taxed, conscripted, and governed, but they were also made stakeholders in Rome's destiny. It was a subtle but powerful mechanism of empire building. Conquest tempered by inclusion.
As the 3rd century BCE dawned, Rome stood as the dominant power in Italy, yet its ambitions reached further. To the south lay the Greek colonies of Magna Graecia, wealthy and cosmopolitan, but fragmented and vulnerable. When the city of Tarentum sought the aid of the Epirot king Pyrrhus to repel Roman encroachment, Rome faced one of its most sophisticated adversaries yet. Pyrrhus brought war elephants, Macedonian phalanxes, and a dream of uniting the Greek world under his leadership. Though Pyrrhus won several costly battles, giving rise to the term Pyrrhic victory, he failed to rally the Italian Greeks and ultimately withdrew. Rome's patient endurance, bolstered by near-infinite manpower and civic loyalty, outlasted his ambitions. By 270 BCE, all of southern Italy lay under Roman control. Yet this triumph brought Rome into the gaze of an even greater power across the sea, Carthage. Carthage was everything Rome was not: maritime, mercantile, and oligarchic. Founded by Phoenicians and centered in modern-day Tunisia, it dominated the western Mediterranean through trade, naval supremacy, and a vast network of client territories. The two powers had coexisted uneasily, but with Rome's expansion into southern Italy and Sicily, friction became inevitable. The First Punic War erupted in 264 BCE, a 23-year conflict that would redefine the Mediterranean world. At the outset, Rome lacked a navy, yet in characteristic fashion, it built one from scratch, reverse engineering a captured Carthaginian quinquereme. Roman innovation produced the corvus, a boarding device that allowed land-trained legionaries to fight at sea. Though prone to capsizing in storms,
This invention helped Rome win a series of unlikely naval victories. The war was long and bitter, fought not just in Sicily, but in Sardinia, Corsica, and North Africa. Finally, in 241 BCE, Carthage, exhausted and bankrupt, sued for peace. Rome claimed Sicily, its first province outside the Italian mainland. Victory brought new challenges. Rome had become an empire in all but name. Governing distant provinces required new administrative tools, new taxes, and new military commitments. The strains of overseas rule began to test the republican framework. Yet Rome pushed onward, now the master of the central Mediterranean. Carthage, however, had not disappeared. Reeling from defeat, it turned its focus to Iberia, where the Barcid family, led by the brilliant Hamilcar Barca, built a new power base. His son Hannibal, raised in the shadow of Rome's betrayal, would become the Republic's most formidable enemy. In 218 BCE, Hannibal launched a daring campaign. Marching his army, complete with elephants, over the Alps into northern Italy, he unleashed a series of stunning victories. At Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and Cannae, Roman legions were annihilated. Cannae in particular was a catastrophe. More than 50,000 Roman soldiers were killed in a single day. The Roman Republic teetered on the edge of collapse. Allies defected. Panic gripped the capital. Yet Rome refused to yield. Under the cautious strategy of Fabius Maximus, nicknamed the Delayer, Rome avoided pitched battles, harassed Hannibal's supply lines, and slowly regained its footing. New generals emerged, most notably Scipio, later known as Africanus, who took the war to Spain and then to Africa itself. In 202 BCE, at the Battle of Zama, Scipio confronted Hannibal. It was a final reckoning. The Roman army, disciplined and battle-hardened, triumphed. Carthage was forced into peace, stripped of its fleet, its empire, and its dignity. Rome stood supreme in the Western Mediterranean. Yet with victory came transformation. The Republic had changed. Its armies were no longer citizen militias alone. They were instruments of aristocratic ambition. Wealth from conquests poured into the hands of the elite, distorting Rome's economy and society. Landless veterans, slaves, and urban poor crowded the city. The latifundia, vast estates owned by the wealthy, expanded at the expense of the small farmer. The gap between rich and poor widened, and with it, the Republic's political stability began to fray. Reformers like the Gracchi brothers would soon attempt to address these issues, and civil war would loom on the horizon. Rome had conquered the world, but it would soon struggle to govern itself.
In the late 2nd century BCE, the pressures tearing at the fabric of the Roman Republic could no longer be ignored. Economic inequality had reached intolerable levels. Veterans returned from foreign wars to find their farms seized or ruined, while wealthy elites consolidated land through political manipulation and forced sales. The Roman countryside, once populated by citizen farmers, was being hollowed out, replaced by sprawling latifundia worked by slaves captured in Rome's endless wars. The urban poor swelled in number, displaced and disillusioned, their votes courted by demagogues offering grain doles and entertainment, but little in the way of lasting solutions. Into this crucible stepped Tiberius Gracchus, a scion of the elite who broke with his class to champion the dispossessed. In 133 BCE, as tribune of the plebs, he proposed a land reform law that would redistribute public land, technically owned by the state but long occupied by aristocrats, to the poor. Though not unprecedented in Roman tradition, the proposal sparked fury in the Senate. Tiberius bypassed senatorial approval, taking the issue directly to the popular assembly. The move was seen as a breach of custom, if not of law. Tiberius was accused of aspiring to kingship, and during a riot on Capitoline Hill, he and hundreds of his followers were clubbed to death with chairs and stones. A decade later, his younger brother Gaius Gracchus took up the cause, expanding the reform agenda to include grain subsidies, colonial settlements, and judicial reforms that weakened senatorial authority. He too met a violent end. His death in 121 BCE marked a turning point.
The precedent had been set that political disputes could be settled with murder. The Republic had become a battlefield of ideologies, families, and class interests, and bloodshed was now a tool of policy. With the Gracchi gone, other reformers stepped forward. Gaius Marius, a novus homo, new man of plebeian birth, rose through military success rather than aristocratic lineage. A brilliant general, Marius won acclaim for defeating Jugurtha in North Africa and repelling Germanic invasions in the north. Yet his true legacy lay in military reform. In 107 BCE, Marius opened army recruitment to the Compitae Censi, the landless masses who previously could not serve. In doing so, he created a professional army loyal not to the Senate or the Republic, but to its general. The legions became a path to land, wealth, and citizenship, not just for Romans, but for Italy's disenfranchised. These reforms made Rome stronger in war, but fatally vulnerable in politics. When the command to fight Mithridates of Pontus, a powerful king in Asia Minor, was assigned to Marius in 88 BCE, his rival Lucius Cornelius Sulla refused to accept it. Instead, Sulla marched his army on Rome itself, an unthinkable act. For the first time, a Roman general used his troops to seize control of the capital. Sulla ousted Marius and re-established senatorial supremacy, then departed for the east to wage his campaign. While Sulla was away, Marius returned, seized the city, and initiated a purge of his own. The streets of Rome ran with blood. When Sulla returned victorious from the east, he repeated the cycle, marching again on Rome, defeating his enemies, and initiating proscriptions, lists of citizens marked for death, their property seized, their families ruined. Sulla declared himself dictator, not for a fixed term, but until he believed the Republic had been restored. In theory, he resigned after stabilizing the state. In practice, he left a shattered system where might made right. In the decades that followed, ambitious men exploited this precedent. Power now rested not in election, but in force. The Senate, once the heart of the Republic, became a pawn in the games of generals. Amidst this turmoil, a triumvirate of rising figures emerged, each commanding legions, loyalty, and political clout. They were Gaius Julius Caesar, a populist and brilliant orator, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, known as Pompey the Great, Rome's most celebrated general, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, whose wealth had been built on war, speculation, and the suppression of the Spartacus slave revolt. In 60 BCE, these three men formed an informal alliance, the First Triumvirate, uniting their interests to dominate Roman politics. Caesar, leveraging their support, was elected consul and later given a proconsular command in Gaul. There, over the course of nearly a decade, he carved out an empire through conquest, defeating the Helvetii, the Belgae, the Veneti, and ultimately Vercingetorix at Alasia. His commentaries on the Gallic War, a literary and political masterpiece, elevated his fame and brought untold riches to Rome. But Caesar's success bred fear. Pompey, who once his ally, grew jealous and drifted toward the Senate. Crassus, attempting to match his rival's glory, marched east to fight the Parthians in 53 BCE, only to be killed at the disastrous Battle of Carrhae. With Crassus gone, the balance of power shifted. The Senate, emboldened by Pompey, ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome. Instead, in 49 BCE, Caesar crossed the Rubicon River with his legions, a direct act of rebellion. As he reportedly said, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. Civil war engulfed the Republic once more. Caesar moved swiftly, capturing Rome, defeating Pompeian forces in Spain, and eventually confronting Pompey himself at Pharsalus in Greece in 48 BCE. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was treacherously murdered. Caesar, following him, arrived in Alexandria and became embroiled in the dynastic struggle between Ptolemy XIII and his sister Cleopatra VII. Supporting Cleopatra, Caesar helped her secure the throne, and their alliance would soon produce a child, Caesarion. Returning to Rome, Caesar was now dictator in name and reality. He enacted sweeping reforms, settling veterans in colonies, revising the calendar to the solar-based Julian system, and restructuring debt. Yet he also centralized power to an unprecedented degree. In 44 BCE, he declared himself dictator perpetuo, dictator for life. To many, this was the rebirth of monarchy in all but name. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, a group of senators led by Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus assassinated Caesar on the floor of the theater of Pompeii. Their daggers ended one life, but unleashed another cycle of chaos. The conspirators claimed to have saved the Republic, but what followed was not restoration, it was war. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant, allied with Caesar's adopted heir, Gaius Octavius, later known as Augustus, and Marcus Lepidus, forming the Second Triumvirate. Together, they defeated the assassins at Philippi in 46 BCE. Yet unity gave way to rivalry. Lepidus was sidelined, and Antony's alliance with Cleopatra drew suspicion and disdain. In 31 BCE, Octavian's forces defeated Antony and Cleopatra at the naval battle of Actium. The lovers fled to Egypt and, facing capture, committed suicide. Rome now belonged to Octavian. In 27 BCE, he formally relinquished extraordinary powers only to be granted greater authority by the Senate in return. He became Augustus, the revered one, princeps, or first citizen. Though the Republic's forms remained, the Senate still met, consuls were elected. It was an illusion. Power rested in one man. The empire had begun. Augustus ruled wisely and cautiously. He avoided the title king, preferring to present himself as a restorer of tradition. Under his reign, the Roman world entered the Pax Romana, a 200-year period of relative peace and prosperity. The empire's frontiers were secured, the roads patrolled, the seas cleared of pirates. Art, architecture, and literature flourished. Virgil penned the Aeneid, connecting Rome's destiny to Trojan heroism. Livy chronicled its past. Horace and Ovid sang its pleasures and myths. Augustus reformed the army, creating a standing force with fixed terms of service and retirement benefits. He established the Praetorian Guard to protect the emperor and maintain order. The provinces were reorganized, taxes rationalized, and a civil service developed. The imperial cult, worship of the emperor and his genius, began to grow, especially in the East. Though Augustus claimed humility, he accepted temples in his name, and by the time of his death in 14 AD, he was declared a god. Rome had passed a threshold. The Republic was dead, its memory enshrined in ritual and rhetoric. What emerged was a monarchy in all but name, wrapped in republican garb. The imperial system would endure for centuries, adapting, breaking, and reforming, but always tracing its lineage to the moment one man ruled in the name of peace.
With the death of Augustus in 14 CE, the reins of empire passed to his stepson and adopted heir Tiberius. Though Augustus had carefully crafted a system that cloaked autocracy in the robes of republicanism, the transition of power revealed the monarchy that now ruled Rome. Tiberius, a capable general and administrator, proved less adept at the politics of image. Taciturn, withdrawn, and increasingly suspicious, he soon alienated the Senate and the Roman people. He left Rome for Capri in his later years, governing through a web of informants and enforcers. Under his rule, the deletones, formal accusations, became tools of personal vendetta. Executions and confiscations marked a darkening of the political atmosphere, and trust in the Principate began to fray. Upon Tiberius's death in 37 CE, the empire was briefly infused with hope as his great-nephew Gaius, better known as Caligula, ascended the throne. A child of the beloved Germanicus, Caligula was welcomed with enthusiasm. But within months, his behavior became erratic, cruel, and bizarre. Whether due to illness or megalomania, Caligula indulged in spectacle, declared himself a living god, and humiliated the Senate with calculated contempt. He is remembered for his indulgence in cruelty, for making his horse a priest, and perhaps planning to make it a consul, and for executing friends and allies on a whim. In 41 CE, the Praetorian Guard, tasked with protecting the emperor,
turned against him and murdered him in his palace. The guard then elevated an unlikely candidate, Claudius, Caligula's uncle, who had long been dismissed as a stammering, awkward scholar. But Claudius proved a competent and pragmatic ruler. He expanded the empire, most notably through the conquest of Britannia in 43 CE, and reformed the bureaucracy. He relied heavily on freed men, former slaves, as administrators, bypassing the senatorial elite. This reliance bred resentment. His marriage to Agrippina the Younger, his niece, brought intrigue to the imperial court. Agrippina secured the succession for her son, Nero, possibly by poisoning Claudius in 54 CE. Nero began his reign with promise, guided by wise advisors like Seneca and Burrus. The early years were marked by moderation and public works. But as Nero matured, he embraced art over governance, seeking fame as a musician and actor. His paranoia grew. He ordered the deaths of his mother, his wife, and many senators. In 64 CE, a great fire devastated Rome. Rumors swirled that Nero had ordered the blaze to clear space for his golden palace. To deflect blame, he accused the Christians, a small, obscure sect, of arson, initiating Rome's first imperial persecution of the faith. His extravagance and tyranny alienated all classes. By 68 CE, as revolt spread through the provinces, Nero fled the city and committed suicide. His death ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty. What followed was chaos. The year 69 CE became known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Galba, a stern senator, was assassinated by his own troops. Otho, his successor, ruled for mere months before committing suicide after defeat by Vitellius. Vitellius, indulgent and brutal, met his end at the hands of the legions loyal to Vespasian, a general then campaigning in Judea. Vespasian emerged as the victor and restored stability. With him began the Flavian dynasty. Vespasian ruled with practical efficiency. A man of humble origins, he stabilized the economy, reformed the military, and embarked on ambitious building projects, including the construction of the Flavian Amphitheater, better known as the Colosseum. He was succeeded in 79 CE by his son Titus, who completed the Jewish War with the sack of Jerusalem in 70 CE. The spoils of that campaign funded much of the Flavian building program, and the Arch of Titus still commemorates the triumph. Titus's short reign was marked by disasters, a volcanic eruption at Vesuvius, which buried Pompeii and Herculaneum, and a devastating fire in Rome. His death in 81 CE brought his brother Domitian to power. Domitian was a paradox, autocratic and secretive, yet competent and efficient. He secured the frontiers, improved administration, and maintained public order. Yet he ruled as a despot, demanding worship, executing senators, and ruling through fear. His emphasis on divine authority and military discipline alienated Rome's elite. In 96 CE, he was assassinated in a palace conspiracy, and the Senate declared his memory damnatio memoriae, condemned to oblivion. With Domitian's death, Rome entered a new golden age under the so-called Five Good Emperors. Nerva, a cautious elder statesman, was chosen by the Senate and ruled briefly. Recognizing the need for military loyalty, he adopted the popular general Trajan as his heir. This practice, adopting a capable successor rather than relying on blood, defined the era. Trajan, R98 to 117, expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent, conquering Dacia, modern-day Romania, campaigning deep into Parthian territory, and lavishing the city of Rome with monumental architecture, including Trajan's Forum and Column. Hadrian, his successor, took a different approach. Philosophical and cosmopolitan, Hadrian focused on consolidation rather than expansion. He traveled widely, inspecting provinces, fortifying borders, and building Hadrian's Wall in northern Britannia. He promoted Greek culture, built the Pantheon anew, and organized the empire's legal system. Yet his reign was also marked by harsh suppression of a Jewish revolt in Judea, which resulted in massive casualties and the renaming of the province to Syria Palestina in an effort to erase Jewish identity. Antoninus Pius, who followed, presided over a time of peace and prosperity. His reign is often remembered as uneventful, which, in imperial terms, was a blessing. His adopted son Marcus Aurelius was a philosopher-emperor, the author of the Meditations, a stoic reflection on duty, suffering, and impermanence. But his reign was far from peaceful. Rome faced renewed pressure from Germanic tribes on the Danube and a deadly plague, possibly smallpox, that swept through the empire. Despite these trials, Marcus ruled with wisdom and restraint. Yet his one mistake proved fatal. Breaking with the tradition of adoption, he passed power to his biological son, Commodus. The boy emperor brought the Pax Romana to a brutal end.
Commodus, the biological son of Marcus Aurelius, inherited an empire that had been stabilized through discipline, philosophy, and a cautious balancing of power. But he was none of those things. Where his father was austere and contemplative, Commodus was theatrical, impulsive, and increasingly deranged. Though his early reign began under the guidance of competent advisors, he soon grew paranoid, dismissing and executing those he deemed disloyal. Styling himself as a reincarnation of Hercules, Commodus donned a lion's skin and entered the gladiatorial arena, shocking Rome's elite with his narcissism and disregard for dignity. He renamed Rome Colonia Commodiana, reminted coins in his likeness as a god, and required senators to worship him. His assassination in 192 CE, concocted by his inner circle, including his concubine Marcia, was both inevitable and deeply destabilizing. The empire fell once again into chaos. What followed was a year of upheaval known as the Year of the Five Emperors. Pertinax, a respected senator, was proclaimed emperor but ruled for only 3 months before being killed by the Praetorian Guard for attempting to impose discipline. The Guard then auctioned the throne to the highest bidder, Didius Julianus, whose reign was both disgraceful and brief. Provincial legions, disgusted by events in Rome, declared their own generals as emperors. Septimius Severus, commanding legions in Pannonia, marched on Rome, defeated rivals, and secured the throne. Thus began the Severan dynasty. Severus was a shrewd, battle-hardened general who restructured the Roman military. He increased the size of the army, raised soldiers' pay, and allowed them to marry while in service. His rule was marked by campaigns in Parthia and Britain, but also by centralization of power and suppression of senatorial authority. Enrich the soldiers and scorn all others, he advised his sons, a policy that would define the empire's coming decades. After his death in 211 CE, his sons Caracalla and Geta inherited the throne, but their rivalry was deadly. Caracalla murdered Geta in their mother's arms and ordered a damnatio memoriae, an erasure of his brother's image and name from all public records. His most enduring legacy was the Constitutio Antoninea in 212 CE, which granted Roman citizenship to nearly all free men within the empire. It was a bold move that expanded tax revenue and symbolically united the empire, but also diluted the prestige of citizenship itself. Caracalla's rule grew increasingly autocratic and blood-soaked, ending in his assassination during a military campaign. The following decades plunged Rome into a prolonged crisis. Between 235 and 284 CE, over 20 emperors would rise and fall, many ruling for only a few months. Most died violently, at the hands of soldiers, rivals, or foreign enemies.
This period, known as the crisis of the 3rd century, nearly broke the Roman state. The economy collapsed under the weight of constant civil wars, debasement of currency, and disruption of trade. Plagues ravaged the population. The borders crumbled under pressure from Germanic tribes, Goths, Persians, and others. In some regions, local leaders broke away entirely. The Gallic Empire formed in the west, and the Palmyrene Empire rose in the east under the powerful and charismatic Queen Zenobia. Roman unity teetered on the brink, saved only by the iron will of a few military emperors. Among them, Aurelian stood out. A peasant by birth and soldier by merit, Aurelian reigned from 270 to 275 CE and is credited with reuniting the fractured empire. He crushed Zenobia, reclaimed the Gallic territories, and earned the title Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. He also began construction on a massive wall around the city of Rome, reflecting a sobering new reality. The empire's capital was no longer invulnerable. But the true architect of imperial survival was Diocletian. Rising from humble origins, he seized power in 284 CE and ruled for over 2 decades. Recognizing the impossibility of managing such a vast realm alone, Diocletian implemented the Tetrarchy, a system of 4 emperors, 2 senior Augusti and 2 junior Caesars, each ruling a quarter of the empire. This division aimed to provide stability, quicker responses to threats, and a clear succession. He reorganized the provinces, increased bureaucracy, standardized taxation, and introduced economic controls to combat inflation, including the infamous Edict on Maximum Prices. He also embarked on widespread persecution of Christians, viewing their refusal to honor traditional gods and imperial cults as a threat to Roman unity. Diocletian's reign ended in an unprecedented act, voluntary abdication. In 305 CE, he retired to a palace in modern-day Croatia, tending to his gardens, while the empire he restructured continued to struggle with succession. Within a few years, civil war erupted once more. Among the contenders was Constantine, the son of Constantius Chlorus, one of the former Caesars. In 312 CE, as Constantine approached Rome to face his rival Maxentius, he experienced a vision. According to legend, he saw a cross in the sky with the words, "In hoc signo vinces," "In this sign you will conquer."
He ordered his soldiers to paint Christian symbols on their shields and march to victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Afterward, Constantine became sole emperor of the West, and later, after defeating Licinius in 324 CE, of the entire Roman Empire. His reign marked one of the most transformative eras in Roman history. Constantine's most radical act was the legalization of Christianity. The Edict of Milan in 313 CE granted religious tolerance to all faiths, but Christianity was clearly favored. Constantine himself became a patron of the Church, commissioning basilicas, exempting clergy from taxation, and convening the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, which produced the Nicene Creed, an effort to unify Christian doctrine. Though he was not baptized until his deathbed, Constantine fundamentally altered the religious landscape of the empire. The Christian faith, once persecuted, now found itself allied with imperial power. He also founded a new capital, Constantinople, built on the site of ancient Byzantium. Dedicated in 330 CE, the city was conceived as a new Rome, strategically located, well-defended, and Christian in character. It would become the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire for over 1,000 years, long after the West had fallen. Though Constantine restored unity, the empire was no longer what it once had been. The Senate held little real authority. The army, now filled with non-Italians and foederati, barbarian allies, often determined the fate of emperors. Economic disparity remained vast. Pagan temples still stood, but Christian churches were rising beside them.
Roman identity itself was evolving, from a city-based polytheistic republic to a multi-ethnic Christian empire centered in the East. After Constantine's death in 337 CE, his sons divided the empire and soon fell into conflict. Though unity was briefly restored under Constantius II, the empire again fractured upon his death. Julian, known as the Apostate, briefly attempted a pagan revival, but his early death in 363 CE ended that experiment. Subsequent emperors, especially Theodosius I, fully embraced Christianity. Paganism was outlawed, the Olympic Games were ended, and the temples of the old gods were shuttered. By the end of the 4th century, the Western Roman Empire was increasingly vulnerable. Internal corruption, economic decline, and an over-reliance on mercenary forces left it exposed. In 376 CE, a wave of Gothic refugees crossed the Danube, fleeing the advancing Huns. Poorly treated by Roman officials, they rebelled. In 378 CE, at the Battle of Adrianople, Emperor Valens led a Roman army to confront the Goths, and was killed along with tens of thousands of his troops. It was one of the worst defeats in Roman history, exposing the military's limits and the vulnerability of the empire's Balkan heartlands. Though Theodosius I temporarily restored order, the empire could no longer function as a single unit. In 395 CE, upon his death, the empire was permanently divided between his sons, Honorius in the west and Arcadius in the east. From this point forward, two Roman empires would exist, one Latin, one Greek, one declining, the other enduring.
The division of the Roman Empire in 395 CE into eastern and western halves under Arcadius and Honorius was more than a mere administrative convenience. It marked the beginning of a profound divergence in fate. While the Eastern Empire, with its wealth, trade networks, and fortified capital at Constantinople, remained relatively secure, the Western Roman Empire began an irreversible descent into fragmentation and collapse. The Western Empire under Honorius was ruled in name from Ravenna, but true power was wielded by generals and court officials. Among them, the half-Vandal general Stilicho served as the de facto protector of the West, fighting off waves of invasions and internal threats. He faced an especially grave threat from Alaric, king of the Visigoths, who demanded land and recognition for his people within the empire. Stilicho managed to repel him more than once, but internal politics proved deadlier. In 408 CE, Stilicho was executed by court rivals, and Roman leadership descended into chaos. Alaric took advantage of the disorder, and in 410 CE, his forces entered and sacked Rome. For Romans, it was an unthinkable catastrophe. The Eternal City, untouched by foreign invaders for over 800 years, was now at the mercy of barbarians. Though Alaric's sack was relatively restrained, churches were spared and mass slaughter avoided, the psychological blow was immense. It signaled that the empire could no longer defend its own heart. Pagan voices decried the abandonment of the old gods, while Christian thinkers like Augustine of Hippo offered spiritual consolation, penning The City of God to argue that Rome's earthly fall was irrelevant compared to the eternal kingdom of heaven. Over the next decades, the Western Empire steadily lost control over its provinces. Britain, facing mounting threats from Saxons, Picts, and Scots, was effectively abandoned by the central government in 410 CE. The local Romano-British population, left to fend for themselves, entered a long and troubled period that would later be remembered as the beginning of England's Dark Ages. In Gaul, Roman rule persisted in name, but was increasingly challenged by Frankish, Burgundian, and Visigothic kingdoms. Hispania saw similar erosion, with Suebi and Vandals carving out their own realms. In North Africa, the situation deteriorated rapidly. In 429 CE, the Vandals, under Genseric, crossed from Spain into Roman Africa. By 439, they had captured Carthage, Rome's old nemesis, now its lifeline. North Africa had been a vital source of grain and wealth for the Western Empire, and its loss dealt a crippling blow. The Vandals established a naval power that harried Mediterranean trade and even sacked Maumeguen in 455 CE, this time with more thorough devastation. Temples, palaces, and homes were stripped of valuables. The Empress Licinia Eudoxia and her daughters were taken hostage. Meanwhile, in Italy, a series of puppet emperors ruled under the thumb of Germanic generals. One of the most capable was Aetius, who successfully rallied Roman and barbarian forces to repel the advance of Attila the Hun at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451 CE. This victory, though costly, saved Western Europe from Hunnic domination. But Aetius's reward was assassination, ordered by Emperor Valentinian III, who himself was murdered soon after. The Western Empire degenerated into a parade of emperors with short and powerless reigns. The real authority lay with military strongmen, many of whom were of non-Roman origin. In 476 CE, the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustus, and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople. This act marked the official end of the Western Roman Empire, though for most of its citizens, the event passed quietly. Roman culture, law, and language did not vanish overnight. In Italy, life continued under Odoacer, who ruled nominally as a client of the Eastern Emperor, but in practice as an independent king. In the Eastern Roman Empire, meanwhile, endured. Centered in Constantinople, it retained many of the institutions, traditions, and ambitions of the Old Rome. Under Emperor Zeno, it acknowledged the loss of the West without attempting to restore it directly. But the Eastern Empire remained Roman in law and administration and Christian in faith, now increasingly defined through theological councils and imperial decrees. In the 6th century, the Eastern Empire would reassert itself dramatically under Justinian I, who launched campaigns to reclaim lost Western provinces. But before that golden age of reconquest, the Byzantine state, as it would later be called, faced its own challenges: religious disputes, court intrigues, and the rising threat of Persia. Yet it endured. Even in the West, Rome did not entirely disappear. The Roman Church, under the Bishop of Rome, now called the Pope, became a new center of authority. As emperors faded, bishops and monks rose in influence, preserving knowledge, negotiating with barbarian kings, and spreading Christianity throughout Europe. The Roman Empire had fallen, but its shadow remained. Its language would evolve into the Romance tongues: Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian. Its laws would influence legal systems across Europe. Its roads, aqueducts, and ruins testified to a vanished greatness. Its idea that power could be organized under a single, universal authority would inspire generations of rulers, from Charlemagne to Napoleon to Mussolini. Rome had begun as a village beside a river. It became a republic, then an empire, and finally a memory. But in that memory lay the seeds of a legacy that no sack, no fire, no emperor's death could erase.
Though the Western Roman Empire had fallen by 476 CE, the Eastern Roman Empire, based in Constantinople, not only survived, but flourished in various forms for nearly 1,000 more years. While historians later labeled it the Byzantine Empire, its citizens called themselves Romans, and its emperors claimed the same legacy as Augustus and Constantine. With wealthier provinces, stronger defenses, and more urbanized centers, the East was better positioned to endure the storms that had shattered the West. In the late 5th and early 6th centuries, the Eastern Empire faced internal unrest, religious conflict, and external threats. One of the most important figures to emerge during this period was Emperor Justinian I, who reigned from 527 to 565 CE. A man of immense ambition, Justinian sought to restore the Roman Empire's former glory through a combination of legal reform, monumental architecture, and military conquest. His most lasting achievement was the Corpus Juris Civilis, or Body of Civil Law, a comprehensive codification of Roman law compiled under the direction of the jurist Tribonian. This legal code not only organized centuries of Roman jurisprudence, but also laid the foundation for civil law traditions across Europe and beyond. The principles enshrined in Justinian's laws, contracts, property rights, due process, continue to echo in modern legal systems. But Justinian's ambitions were not confined to the courtroom. In 532 CE, the Nika riots erupted in Constantinople, nearly toppling his regime. What began as a dispute between rival chariot racing factions turned into a full-scale revolt. The Hagia Sophia and much of the city were set ablaze. Facing demands to abdicate, Justinian considered fleeing. It was his wife, Theodora, a former actress and one of history's most remarkable empresses, who persuaded him to stand firm. In a brutal show of force, imperial troops slaughtered tens of thousands in the Hippodrome, crushing the uprising. With the city pacified, Justinian turned to construction. The Hagia Sophia was rebuilt on a grander scale than ever before. Its massive dome, floating seemingly weightlessly above a sea of marble and light, symbolized both divine majesty and imperial authority. It became the spiritual heart of Orthodox Christianity and a wonder of the medieval world. Militarily, Justinian launched campaigns to reconquer the West. His brilliant general, Belisarius, led expeditions that reclaimed North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, and parts of southern Spain from the Visigoths. These reconquests were remarkable but costly. Italy in particular suffered repeated sieges, famines, and devastation. The Gothic Wars left the peninsula depopulated and its cities ruined. Though the campaigns temporarily restored Roman rule to parts of the West, they exhausted the empire's treasury and overstretched its resources.
Meanwhile, a devastating outbreak of bubonic plague struck the empire in 541 CE, the first pandemic recorded in detail. Known as the Plague of Justinian, it killed millions and dramatically weakened the state. Agriculture, trade, and the army all suffered, and the empire entered a period of demographic and economic decline. Even as Justinian pushed forward his vision of imperial grandeur, the reality was increasingly fragile. After his death in 565, his successor struggled to maintain the gains he had made. The Lombards invaded Italy, undoing much of the reconquest. In the east, the long-standing rivalry with the Sassanid Persian Empire escalated. These wars drained resources and left border regions vulnerable. In the 7th century, a new and unforeseen force emerged from the Arabian Peninsula: Islam. Within decades of the Prophet Muhammad's death in 332 CE, Arab Muslim armies swept across the Near East, toppling the Persian Empire and capturing vast territories from Byzantium. Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, all vital and ancient parts of the Roman world, were lost to the Caliphate. These conquests permanently altered the religious, cultural, and political map of the Eastern Mediterranean. The loss of Egypt, in particular, was a devastating blow. It had supplied grain, taxes, and manpower to the empire.
Constantinople now stood alone, the capital of a shrinking realm hemmed in by enemies and internal dissent. The Emperor Heraclius, who had led successful campaigns against the Persians earlier in his reign, now saw much of his work undone. Nevertheless, he reorganized the empire into themes, military districts governed by strategoi, that would serve as the backbone of Byzantine defense for centuries. Culturally and linguistically, the Eastern Empire evolved. Latin gradually gave way to Greek as the language of government and daily life. Byzantine emperors retained Roman titles and claimed continuity with ancient Rome, but their administration, art, and theology were increasingly Hellenic. The Church became central to imperial identity, and religious debates, often highly technical and deeply political, raged across the empire. Disputes over Christ's nature, icon veneration, and ecclesiastical authority shaped Byzantine society as much as wars or laws. In the 7th century, a new and unforeseen force emerged from the Arabian Peninsula: Islam. Within decades of the Prophet Muhammad's death in 332 CE, Arab Muslim armies swept across the Near East, toppling the Persian Empire and capturing vast territories from Byzantium. Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, all vital and ancient parts of the Roman world, were lost to the Caliphate. These conquests permanently altered the religious, cultural, and political map of the Eastern Mediterranean. The loss of Egypt, in particular, was a devastating blow. It had supplied grain, taxes, and manpower to the empire. Constantinople now stood alone, the capital of a shrinking realm hemmed in by enemies and internal dissent. The Emperor Heraclius, who had led successful campaigns against the Persians earlier in his reign, now saw much of his work undone. Nevertheless, he reorganized the empire into themes, military districts governed by strategoi, that would serve as the backbone of Byzantine defense for centuries. Culturally and linguistically, the Eastern Empire evolved. Latin gradually gave way to Greek as the language of government and daily life. Byzantine emperors retained Roman titles and claimed continuity with ancient Rome, but their administration, art, and theology were increasingly Hellenic. The Church became central to imperial identity, and religious debates, often highly technical and deeply political, raged across the empire. Disputes over Christ's nature, icon veneration, and ecclesiastical authority shaped Byzantine society as much as wars or laws. In 717 CE, the empire faced perhaps its gravest threat yet. The Umayyad Caliphate launched a massive siege of Constantinople, seeking to finish what earlier Muslim conquests had begun. But the city's formidable walls, the leadership of Emperor Leo III, and the mysterious incendiary weapon known as Greek fire turned the tide. After a year of siege, the Arab fleet retreated, and Constantinople was saved. The successful defense of the city preserved Christianity in the East and allowed Byzantine to recover some of its strength. Leo III would go on to initiate the iconoclast controversy, a bitter theological dispute over the veneration of icons. Iconoclasts believed religious images violated the commandments and encouraged idolatry. Iconodules defended their use as aids to devotion. Emperors and patriarchs took opposing sides over the course of a century, leading to the destruction of sacred art, persecution of monks, and deep divisions within the Church. Despite these internal strifes, the Byzantine Empire maintained its resilience. Emperors like Basil I in the 9th century initiated cultural and military revival, known as the Macedonian Renaissance. Byzantine scholars preserved and copied ancient texts, and Constantinople once again became a center of learning and opulence. The empire expanded its influence into the Balkans, evangelizing the Slavs through missionaries like Cyril and Methodius, whose creation of the Cyrillic script would leave a lasting legacy in Eastern Europe. The conversion of the Kievan Rus to Orthodox Christianity under Prince Vladimir in 988 CE extended Byzantine cultural and religious influence far beyond its borders. Constantinople's prestige as the Second Rome was unmatched in the Christian world. Yet tensions with the Latin West continued to grow, fueled by theological differences, political rivalry, and mutual suspicion. In 1054 CE, the Great Schism formalized the divide between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. The Pope in Rome and the Patriarch of Constantinople excommunicated each other, a split that would never be fully healed. It was not merely about ritual or doctrine. It was about authority, empire, and identity. The Roman world, once united in faith, was now divided by competing visions of Christianity. Meanwhile, a new power emerged in Asia Minor, the Seljuk Turks. In 1071 CE, at the Battle of Manzikert, the Byzantine army suffered a catastrophic defeat. Emperor Romanus IV was captured, and Anatolia, the empire's heartland, was thrown open to Turkish migration and conquest. The loss of these lands shattered the Byzantine tax base, recruitment systems, and economy. In desperation, the Emperor Alexius I Comnenus appealed to the West for military aid. His call helped spark the First Crusade, an event that would profoundly reshape East-West relations. Though the Crusaders helped recapture parts of Anatolia, they also established their own states in the Levant, largely independent of Byzantine control. Relations between Byzantines and Crusaders were uneasy at best, hostile at worst. This hostility reached its tragic climax in 1204. During the Fourth Crusade, Western European knights, diverted from their original mission, turned on Constantinople. They stormed the city, looted its treasures, desecrated its churches, and established a short-lived Latin empire. The sack of Constantinople was one of the greatest cultural catastrophes in medieval history. Priceless manuscripts, icons, and relics were lost or stolen. The Eastern Roman Empire, humiliated and dismembered, survived only in fragments.
After the Fourth Crusade's devastating sack of Constantinople in 1204, the Byzantine Empire ceased to exist as a unified state. In its place rose a patchwork of successor states. The Latin Empire, centered in Constantinople and ruled by Western Europeans, the Empire of Nicaea in Western Anatolia, the Despotate of Epirus in the Western Balkans, and the Empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast. Among these, the Empire of Nicaea emerged as the most determined to reclaim Constantinople and restore the Byzantine state. For more than 50 years, the Latin Empire held a tenuous grip on the capital, relying on support from Western powers and the Venetian navy. But it was never fully accepted by the Orthodox population, who resented Latin rule and viewed the new regime as a foreign occupation. The Latin emperors struggled with internal dissent, financial instability, and relentless attacks from surrounding Greek and Bulgarian forces. Meanwhile, the rulers of Nicaea, beginning with Theodore I Lascaris and continuing through his successors, consolidated control over Western Asia Minor and parts of the Balkans. By the mid-13th century, the balance had shifted decisively. Under Michael VIII Palaiologos, the Nicaean Empire mounted a successful campaign to retake Constantinople. In 1261, as most of the Latin forces were absent on campaign, a small Nicaean army under General Alexios Strategopoulos entered the city through a neglected postern gate. The Latin defenders were caught by surprise, and Michael VIII was able to proclaim the restoration of the Byzantine Empire.
The Palaeologan dynasty would rule Constantinople for the final 2 centuries of its existence. But the Restoration was a shadow of past glories. The empire Michael VIII reclaimed was diminished, exhausted, and surrounded by rising threats. The city itself was half ruined, its population reduced, its economy shattered. The Anatolian heartland, once the empire's military and agricultural base, was now largely lost to Turkish principalities that had emerged following the collapse of Seljuk power. Chief among these was the Ottoman Beylik, a small but ambitious state centered around Bursa. Throughout the 14th century, Byzantium found itself increasingly dependent on diplomacy, bribes, and shifting alliances. The emperors often turned to Western Europe for assistance, offering to reconcile the Eastern Orthodox Church with Rome in exchange for military aid. But these overtures were met with skepticism and often conditional on total submission to papal authority, an unacceptable price for most of the Byzantine clergy and populace. Internally, the empire was torn by civil war. Disputes over succession, regencies, and imperial prerogative sparked multiple bloody conflicts, most notably between John V Palaiologos and John VI Kantakouzenos. These wars further weakened the empire and invited foreign intervention. Serbian and Bulgarian powers exploited the disorder, carving out territory in the Balkans. Meanwhile, the Ottomans continued their inexorable advance. In 1354, a devastating earthquake damaged the fortress of Gallipoli, allowing the Ottomans their first foothold in Europe. From there, they launched campaigns into Thrace and Macedonia. By the end of the century, they had surrounded Constantinople on nearly all sides. The empire had been reduced to the capital itself, a few scattered Aegean islands, and portions of the Peloponnese.
Despite this, the spirit of Byzantium endured. The city of Constantinople remained a center of scholarship, theology, and Orthodox Christianity. Emperors like Manuel II Palaiologos made desperate journeys to the courts of Western Europe, appealing for help. Some aid was offered, including a few crusader expeditions and financial loans, but it was never enough to reverse the tide. By the early 15th century, the Ottomans had emerged as the dominant power in the region. Their capture of Thessaloniki, parts of Bulgaria, and the defeat of various rival Anatolian principalities left them unchallenged. The empire's last chance for revival vanished when the Christian powers of Europe failed to coordinate effectively in response to the Ottoman threat. A final attempt at religious union was proclaimed at the Council of Florence in 1439, with Byzantine delegates agreeing to Catholic terms. But the union was largely rejected by the Orthodox populace, who saw it as capitulation. In 1451, Sultan Mehmed II, just 19 years old, ascended the Ottoman throne. Brilliant, ambitious, and determined to complete what centuries of Muslim emperors had begun, he made the conquest of Constantinople his chief objective. He spent the next 2 years preparing, constructing the massive fortress of Rumeli-Hisar on the Bosphorus to cut the city off from aid, casting enormous cannons capable of shattering ancient walls, and assembling an army reportedly over 80,000 strong. Constantinople, by contrast, was defended by a mere 7,000 men, Greeks, Italians, and a few mercenaries, under the leadership of the final Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos. The city's ancient Theodosian walls still stood, formidable but aged. The defenders fought with desperate courage,
and Emperor Constantine led from the front, refusing to flee or surrender. On May 29, 1453, after a 53-day siege, the Ottomans launched their final assault. Using massive artillery, breaches in the walls, and overwhelming numbers, they broke through the defenses. Constantine XI, clad in imperial purple, reportedly cast off his regalia and charged into battle, dying sword in hand. His body was never definitively identified.
The city was taken. For 3 days, Ottoman forces looted, burned, and captured, as was customary in conquest. But soon after, Mehmed II entered Hagia Sophia and declared it a mosque. He ordered the city resettled, protected its Christian population, and took the title Caesar-i Rum, Caesar of Rome. Though Western Europe mourned the fall of Constantinople, many also acknowledged Mehmed's power and legitimacy. With that, the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, was no more. But it had not died in vain. Its scholars, fleeing west, carried with them ancient Greek texts and classical knowledge that helped spark the European Renaissance. Its Orthodox faith continued in Russia, Serbia, and the monasteries of Mount Athos. Its art, liturgy, and intellectual legacy lived on in Eastern Christianity. The Roman Empire, from its founding myth in 753 BCE to its final fall in 1453 CE, had lasted more than 2 millennia. It had transformed from a village to a republic to an empire, from Latin-speaking paganism to Greek-speaking Christianity. It had reshaped the world through conquest, law, architecture, language, and ideas. Even in death, Rome's legacy endured. The Holy Roman Empire in the west, Tsarist Russia in the east, the Vatican, the Enlightenment, all drew from its vast well. The dream of Roman order, law, and civilization would continue to haunt and inspire for centuries. Empires rise and fall. Borders shift. Languages evolve. Cities are sacked and rebuilt. But the Roman Empire was more than land or army. It was an idea that survived kings and Caesars, popes and patriarchs, wars and plagues. An idea that still echoes quietly but unmistakably through the foundations of the modern world. And so, our journey comes to an end, for now. We've walked the dusty streets of Rome, passed beneath the shadows of marble palaces, and crossed through ages of war, triumph, and transformation, only to arrive at the twilight of an empire. The buildings may have crumbled, the emperors long forgotten, but the legacy of Rome still lives quietly, pulsing through the foundations of our modern world. If you're still awake, know that your presence has been like music to this quiet corner of history. And if sleep has already taken you, may this story accompany you into dreams as soft as drifting embers. I'd love to know what you felt on this journey. Share it in the comments if you'd like. And if gentle, heartfelt voyages into the past speak to your soul, be sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. For now, I'll say goodbye. But history never really ends. In the next tale, we'll meet again. In another time, another civilization, beside another forgotten legend. Good night, traveler. Rome will remember you.